Hey everyone, and welcome to the Joomla Shack conference. I'm really happy to have George with us again. We had George at last year's Joomla Shack conference, and he gave a really interesting presentation about Joomla 4. And I looked this morning, and it is by far the most viewed video on YouTube about Joomla 4. It has a really in-depth, clear explanation of exactly what's going on and what we can expect, what new features we can expect. George really has a great way of explaining things. And so I'm delighted to have him back again, talking about not Joomla 4 this time, but about the actual kinds of tools that we're using these days and that, George, I suspect you use in your day-to-day job, working for the UK government. Welcome. I'm really happy to have you with us.
Thank you. Yeah, it's good to be back again. So yeah, a bit of a different subject topic this year, looking into kind of more modern tools. And it's exactly what you said. This is a talk that's kind of going to be a bit more technical than some of my previous talks, but something that's much closer, I guess, to the things I do in my work life as opposed to the things that I often do around Joomla. But I also think it's a demonstration of how sometimes the difference between what you think you have and what you actually have a very, or like, when I say what you think you have, so what Joomla does and what a lot of modern websites do is very close, but just subtle differences. And I thought it's interesting to call them out and kind of visually show some of this stuff. So for those of you who haven't met me, by now, I'm George. I'm a senior consulting engineer for Automation Logic, working in DevOps on government projects. I've been on Joomla leadership for 6 years and finished up last year, although I still sit on the production team as release lead. I'm not officially a leadership team person anymore. I'm the J4 release lead, and please feel free to reach out to me. You can find me on the Joomla Glip channel, by email, my GitHub. I'm not the quickest to reply because I do have a fairly intensive job, but I do generally end up replying to everything at some point. So yeah, apologies if you don't get any response on the day, but normally I will reply within a week or so. So where did this talk come from? Well, we talked a bit before about Google Trends and the things that people see on Google Trends. I always like to reference this slide because you may as well embrace it rather than use it as something to cry about. But rather than look at Joomla's on performance this time, I wanted to talk just generally about CMS. I think it's very interesting that WordPress as well is down like 50% in Google Trends over the last 5 years, in the UK at least. I fully accept that that is not representative of everywhere, but I think it is actually quite representative of the kind of stuff I hear from people who work in agencies. And it's a general thing about PHP CMSs. And I think that there's multiple reasons for this. And I want to try and address where the differences are between PHP CMSs and the things that agencies and kind of anything from even like some small, but maybe more technical companies, and pretty much all companies of a medium size and upwards may have as issues or face in their time. So first of all, I want to talk about is the cloud, which is something that is this mysterious buzzword that everyone uses, but no one seems to ever be quite sure what it is. So pretty much any kind of group of servers that contains applications and databases is a cloud. So your traditional PHP shared hosting by whatever your provider you use, SiteGround or Rock'n or whatever it is a cloud technically. But these days, like when people talk about kind of like a more modern cloud, what they're talking about kind of something that has much more than just a PHP and cPanel setup. They're talking about something that's very highly available and distributed across the entire world. They might have things like machine learning and secrets management, but as well as your kind of traditional storage and CDNs, and maybe even something as advanced as container management for Docker containers. So, with all these things, I guess they have much more kind of functionality than kind of maybe what you're used to on your traditional PHP hosting setup. So I guess then that feeds into why people use the cloud. So depth of services, kind of costs, scalability, you pay for what you use and you scale it as required, which is quite a big thing. So if you have like a dev site and you only want to use it in your office hours, then you can shut down that server outside those hours, and you basically won't pay for the cost of running that machine, which you will in, of course, a lot of places. There's lots of flexibility in what you can do. Often there is reduced downtime because you can run things in highly available setups. And alongside that, that gives you great disaster recovery options in case of the worst. Most of these cloud providers these days have good backup management options. There's really good monitoring capabilities far beyond anything any traditional host will give you. And again, there's a group of people, although this is probably less relevant to this talk, but it's worth bringing up, who are moving to things that just run completely serverless. And of course, serverless doesn't literally mean there isn't a server, but it means that the cloud provider manages the server for you in a way, kind of like what you have with your PHP shared host, but it's a bit different to that. It's more like you just run a function. You say, here's the code I want to run. Now go host this for me in a highly scalable way. And there are some really cool things around this that I've worked on in the past, and I know that other people do too. So, oopsie daisy. So, in the modern cloud, I guess, which we were just talking about, people tend to use one of the following three platforms, although, of course, there are others. AWS, which is kind of what I call a general purpose thing, often used by kind of smaller businesses, by far the biggest. So, I mean, they have an estimated turnover these days of well over 8 billion a year. Azure, which is Microsoft's offering, often a bit more corporate based because they're more transparent with how they hold their data and how they secure the data, which bigger corporates tend to favor because they've got security honchos who are very careful about this thing. And then GCP, which is massively focused on big data and scaling data, but of course can still very much host a virtual machine, but therefore a bit more niche. So of course you can see all of these guys have now massive turnovers, and it's increasing by double 50% plus year on year for almost a decade now. It's insane that how much the market is worth already. So having talked about the kind of different options slightly, and as again, there are more options than these three, but like Alibaba is also high on the list, which is big in Asia, and various others. But we're going to kind of focus on AWS. And the reason for that is mainly because it's the biggest. It's arguably a simpler one. And honestly, it's the one that most people are going to know about. I don't know how many of you guys noticed all the blog posts. I think it was about 2 or 3 weeks ago now when just one AWS region fell over in North Virginia. And North Virginia was the original AWS region, so it happens to have much higher usage. And everything from people's doorbells to vacuum cleaners and all the rest of it fell over because they all depended on that single region being available, which is always fun to read all the tweets. So AWS is Amazon's offering, loads and loads and loads of services baked in. You can see the big services cheat sheet there that someone's built in order to kind of try and make their lives easier. But long and short is it's Amazon's offering dozens of services, tons of things. Like it's kind of reached beyond the point now with like hundreds of services where there's any one person who's really going to know in depth what they all do. But there's loads of small things that you're going to kind of fairly routinely use if you ever started using this stuff, because you're never going to really use machine learning or the blockchain offerings or all that kind of stuff. So in a traditional PHP environment, you might set up what's called a virtual private, can't remember. Anyway, the network layer, you're going to set up a network layer with some security groups and stuff to make sure that you're the only person who can access it, or whatever limits you may want to have on your network. You're going to set up some storage. You're going to set up a Linux machine. You're going to set up a MySQL instance, and you're going to set up a DNS so anybody who goes to your domain can end up on your Linux machine. And if that sounds very complicated, don't worry. First of all, it takes time to get used to all this stuff, but also I'd say that there are ways that you can get around this. There are tools to help you get onboarded onto this stuff. And the main tool, AWS has their own tool for this called Elastic Beanstalk. This is a product that they give you that basically allows you to set up pre-baked environments for specific languages, of which PHP is one. So these are basically all the steps. So the first step is actually the smaller image on the far right, which is asking me to input my application name. it asks me to upload my code. So I uploaded a zip of the Joomla 4 nightly build. This was last week. And then it gave me this big box you can see in the middle, which asked me to implement all sorts of fun things. So I told it which network I wanted it to be part of. There was a default one out the box. I told it to create a database, a MySQL database specifically. And that was, I think, it for stage 1. Oh, I also told it to use a SSH key so I could log onto the box. 15 minutes of waiting later, it told me that I had set up my PHP 7.4 platform. So I went to the URL and here was my Joomla install. And as I say, that took me less than 20 minutes to set up without any real effort involved. And if you guys want to, you can see the URL at the top there. I've ran the installer now and you can actually go see it. In fact, we might take a look in a minute. And this is going to cost me, like, I think AWS told me it was something about $19 a month they were projecting, which sounds like a lot, but I've also set up a multiple redundant database. So I've set it up so that I have a clone of a database in a secondary region so that my database stays up. Obviously, if you're just building a dev environment, that wouldn't be required and you could cut your costs considerably by doing so. Comes at a caveat that this is not for production setups. This is just to help you get a setup working and some of these stuff up and running. And I guess then it comes down to why am I telling you that this is a not for production setup? And the first reason why it's not a production setup is basically to do with the way that Joomla deals with configuration. So in the world of the internet, people don't really use static configuration files like we do with our configuration.php setup. So when you run your installation of Joomla, for those of you who don't know, the Joomla installer basically does two things. It creates your configuration.php file, which goes into the root of your Joomla directory and contains things like your database hosts and your database installation, your mail setup. Everything you can access in global configuration goes into this file. And it also installs your database for you. And the thing is that these aren't used so much these days. And there's specific reasons for that. One of them is that people like these days to be able to carry their code base between environments. And they like to have everything pretty much committed in some form or another. And like the configuration.php file doesn't really conform to that. It's quite static, it's monolithic. There's no way to easily set variables other than running the Joomla installer or going through a GUI. And people want to automate things these days. They don't want to have to use a user interface to set everything up. They want to be able to do this repeatedly across multiple environments, whether that's dev, pre-prod, prod, etc. And yeah, even in a typical Joomla setup these days, a lot of us use a pre-prod and a dev setup on our laptops and a prod setup in the cloud, and sometimes even a staging environment for our bigger customers that's also available for your customers. One of the things that's being built to get around this is called the .env project, and this is available in multiple languages. If you use Node.js, you'd use this. In a lot of modern PHP setups, notably Laravel, you'd use this. But it comes in multiple languages. I believe the original version of this was in Ruby. So loads of languages have this similar concept. And basically, it allows you, in a very similar way, to pull in variables either from environment variables, which are basically variables that are defined in your operating system, or from static files, kind of like what our configuration.php is. And actually, by using something like this, we could actually use Joomla in the Beanstalk project. And if you're asking why that sounds so subtly different, the reason is that Beanstalk, as I will go back a couple of slides here, it wants to pass in all the variables it needs to set up a site by environment variables. So in the instances section here, it doesn't actually show it here, but in the instances section, you have the ability to set environment variables up. And then you could pass these through into each environment that you create in Beanstalk. Yeah, so this would allow use of Joomla in a Beanstalk project. And if you want to, and as I say, this is because Beanstalk wants you to have this big zip that uploads all your files directly. And Joomla doesn't have that. We have this installation package. And if we upload the installation package every time, then we're going to be told to either delete it or to go back into the installer. So every time you want to upload a new version, you're going to have this conflict between whether you have a configuration file present or an installation directory present. So to show you kind of the difference between these styles, on the left here, we have, top left, we have the Joomla configuration class. We can see here, this is like the standard Joomla installation on the left. So you can see the offline messages, the site names, the database settings, which are all empty in this case. This is what actually ships with Joomla in its installation folder. And in the bottom left, you can see how we actually get all these variables out. This is Joomla setting up its database driver. In the middle and the right-hand side, these are Laravel's equivalents. So the middle image with has the .env file you can see. This has a list of key value pairs. Again, you can see it's a very similar concept. This was the old Laravel Quick Start guide I've copied this from, by the way. So DB password is secret isn't really going to get you anywhere. But you can see it's kind of a similar concept, but it's different. And the reason it's different is because if you passed in an environment variable, all these variables will get overridden. In fact, the entire file is actually optional. And Laravel recommends that you don't even have a file in production at all. And on the right-hand side, you can see that a sample way you get it through this magic env function that they have, which allows you to plumb into PHP's environment variables, which are available the same way they would be if you had $_post, if you're setting up your, you're trying to get your data out your post request from a form submission in Joomla. What can Joomla do about this and why? So I'm going to do a very quick demo of some proof of concept code I mocked up on this here. So this is some proof of concept code I mocked up. So we talked before about what Joomla's configuration.php looked like, and we saw that it was actually what I'm going to do is I'm going to open up. I'm going to show you before and after before I get too into it. I'm not going to spend too long on this code, so don't worry if it's a bit confusing. So Joomla's default configuration.php looks a bit like this. So you've got a whole bunch of class properties which all have these static values. So how can we move from this kind of format to this kind of environment variable based format? Well, actually, it turns out it's not as hard as you think. So we can use this kind of, we can try and get variables out, and we can set the same defaults that we have in our default configuration.php. And we can say, pull these from somewhere local. And we can go through. This method is basically how you do it. We use this library that we talked about earlier, this .env project. And actually, pretty much that's it. We just have to require that project in. And if you really want to, we can say that, oh, we don't actually need an installation directory anymore. As long as someone manually sets up the SQL database, which some people already do in Joomla right now, then you actually don't even need to run the installer anymore. If you set all these variables up with the right settings, then actually you can just go. And of course, that's not going to be for everyone. And there's no implication that this needs to be for everyone, because ultimately this is still just a valid configuration.php file for Joomla that, you know, you can still generate one out the installer if you want to. This is giving you another option on how to set your site up that gives you more flexibility if you're a developer. And the last thing to do is to make sure that if any .env files are present, the file versions, then we can load them up safely. And the reason that we then we'd still kind of have two configuration files if we did that, but that's just us trying to make sure we keep optimal compatibility with Joomla for minimal change. Okay, so as I said, I don't want to dwell too long on that because we're actually, I'm going to probably put too many people off. But you guys can all go look at my feature branch here, and I can absolutely tell you that I uploaded this into Beanstalk, and Beanstalk was very, very happy with it. And we'll take a look at exactly what environment variables we need to set up a bit later in this talk. So what we've had is we've had this Linux machine that gets destroyed and rebuilt, because that's how Beanstalk works. And the reason I also say it's not for production is that every time you upload this new zip of what you want to install, it will tear down your machine and rebuild it every time you make a new deployment from our zip file. So there's still questions remaining, of course, after my pull request. For example, we basically would need to disable use of global config in the Joomla user interface, because you wouldn't actually be able to set them directly anymore. You'd have to set them by environment variables and redeploy. So you need some sort of switch. Ideally, we probably still would like to set up our SQL database through some sort of better user interface. We don't want to tell all our users, here's some SQL files, go off and set them up yourself. And also, there's this issue that if we did things this way, I've just installed a default Joomla setup by uploading the entire zip file of Joomla. Ideally, you don't want to have to do that, obviously, because you're going to need to, every time you install extensions and stuff, or when you run a Joomla upgrade and you update your extensions, you have to commit all those files somewhere into Git or something similar. That's obviously really annoying. Don't want to have to do that. So, there's still, I'm not saying that by adding in this single configuration file, everything magically drops out, but it's a small thing, but it has a big impact on the way that people interact with Joomla and its configuration settings and the ability to automate the deployment. And I say automate the deployment. I've said that probably quite a few times already. And I guess I should explain a bit more about this. So automating things. So kind of my job, I guess, with the government is largely around the automation and creation of things. Or as a former team lead told me, I really hate GUIs, don't I? So we're going to use kind of two tools to kind of automate this setup of Joomla, because obviously I hate the AWS interface so much. But these are similar tools to what a lot of people in digital agencies are using these days. So I think it's kind of relevant. So I'm going to use the AWS CLI. There are install instructions there. And I'm going to show you the commands I run in a second, but I'll just add that I've already authenticated to my personal AWS account already. And I've got this JQ library, which is parsing for Bash. I don't actually use it in the examples, but I think it's very useful to have around for various different things, because I'm going to kind of quickly skip over things. And effectively, for the next bit of this talk, I'm going to follow an AWS tutorial here that I've linked to, which you guys can all follow in your own time. The only thing I've done is I'm being a bit more specific than their generic PHP environment, because obviously I want to deploy a Joomla instance, not just any random PHP application. So the first part about Beanstalk is you've got to set up a storage account. Why do you need a storage account? Because it needs to store your application somewhere. So we tell Elastic Beanstalk to create me a storage account. And it gives me back, you see there, an S3 bucket. And we said S3 is the storage thing. So it's basically an area that I can install my Joomla zip file into. When I tell it to take my Joomla zip and deploy it, it will store it in this location before uploading it onto my Linux machine. The next thing I tell it to do is to create me an application, and I've called it George Joomla CLI. Any application name will do. It needs to be unique in your AWS region, but beyond that, that's fine. And you can see AWS gives me a lot of JSON malarkey there, but basically what it comes down to is it's being created. You can see that there's a date created stamp in the middle of all of that, and it gives me a whole bunch of extra information. The next thing I then do is I upload my SSH key, because I want to be able to SSH onto these boxes and do things. This is a one-off setup. You wouldn't need to do this. This is a one-time setup for however many of these Elastic Beanstalk instances you create. The next step is to upload my instance of Joomla. So I have downloaded I've actually generated a local copy of Joomla, but it kind of doesn't matter. You can download it from our nightly packages. Anything works. And we tell AWS to upload it. So we say AWS to S3, copy my local zip file, which was in my case in build temp packages, up to the S3 bucket that we got. And that's just copy pasted from the string we got back in the very first step on this slide. I dumped in a folder test just to prove that it can be in any folder. It doesn't really matter. But it could just be in the root as well. It could just be the bucket name / the zip file name. Doesn't matter. And we upload it. And then we do the first thing, which is that we tell Elastic Beanstalk now, create my version of my application. I'll give it an application name, which we got from the previous step, which was George Joomla CLI. I'll give it a version, which is v1. And I tell it to look at the zip file I uploaded in the previous step. So effectively what I've said is create a new version and my code lives here. That's what these two steps have done. So it's not too complicated so far. So the next step is very complicated, but actually, here's a hint. I didn't know how to write this one either. I just copy pasted it from the Amazon documentation. So don't worry if you don't necessarily understand what this does, but the long and short is that it gives you back the list of all possible PHP versions that I've got available to run on. So I've asked it to basically give me a list, and you can see back there, it gives me a list of PHP versions that run from PHP 5.4 up to PHP 7.4. A couple are duplicated because they both run on the Amazon Linux operating system and the Amazon Linux 2 operating system, which are two different operating systems, kind of akin to Windows versus Mac versus Linux. And once I now know what PHP version I want to run, I tell it to create me some configuration for my application. So previously, again, we have our application name, which is George Joomla CLI. We've run this a few times now. The template name is still v1. We said that in the previous slide. And we tell it the what they call the solution stack name, but actually is just this PHP version name that we got out of this previous command, the complicated one above on this slide. So there's still nothing too fancy yet. But actually, already what we've done is we have told Amazon to go and set me up a PHP operating system and given it a name. We've uploaded some code, and yeah, that's it. So the final step now is the bit that we've been talking about previously, which is how do we pass all these configuration settings for my environment into the instance? And basically, you specify this big complex JSON file. And it kind of looks a bit scary, but I'll take you through the start of it, and we'll then talk a bit more in the next slide. So first of all, we just say create the environment. We again give it our application name, which was George Joomla CLI. We tell it a CNAME prefix this time, which is basically the domain name you're going to get assigned by AWS. In my case, I've made it the same as my application name to keep things easy. Template name, again, is v1. The version label is also v1. And my environment name I've called v1 initial. And I passed in this JSON file. And the JSON file is actually, as I said, it looks a bit scary, but it's a bit better than it is. So the first thing I pointed to tells me how to set up my Linux box. The second one sets up some basic networking. On a lot of setups, this probably wouldn't be required, but for a long time, I had deleted my default network setups that Amazon gives you to save myself the 50p of budget a month it was charging me. And as a result, I have to specify everything from now on because I don't have a default setup. So that's what the next two are. The third one tells me give it a public IP address. This means that I can access it through the browser. And the final one tells it to use our SSH key that we uploaded earlier so I can get into the box. And whilst it looks complicated, how did I find what all these magic options are? Well, I Googled the AWS documentation. It looks scary, but it's actually a lot of just copy pasting. It's not as bad as you think it is. I literally have copy pasted every single item in that file from something that existed in their online documentation. I mean, that's a lot of what automation is, right? It's copy pasting documentation of someone who's been there and done it before you. So we have this kind of magic file here that we just talked about of settings. So how does this tie up with our Joomla settings? Because obviously none of these things are really Joomla things. These are things to set up an environment in a cloud setup. Well, actually, Amazon have already done this for WordPress, and this is one of the interesting things. So, and what they've done is they've actually not put all their options and configuration options into this big JSON file we just talked about. Some of them can be controlled in the application GitHub repo. So in this case, it's their sample WordPress repo. And you can see here that they've actually put in a lot of these things that we'd actually need. So you can see here, they've set up these environment variables for the auth key, the secure auth key, and RDS hostname, port, DB name, username, password is your database credentials. Now that looks very familiar to this configuration file we were looking at earlier, right? And that's exactly the key thing here is that this file is this mapping layer between what we've just created and the environment we've just created and the stuff we want to pass in. And this is where the magic is going to happen. These things will become environment variables that then our hacked up configuration.php script can read in. And this can either be set, as I said previously, in the JSON file that describes our cloud environment, or it can be set in your extension repo. And these things will basically be split up because it depends on whether it's something that is global for a website or whether it's specific to an environment. So, for example, my dev environment and my production environment might have, I don't know what they might, what's going to be similar, what's going to be different. So, for example, the database names will obviously be different. So we'll set them in the big JSON file. However, the site name might be exactly the same because they're still my shop name as their site name. So this might be in the GitHub repo for your website. And you can split these things up in a way that you kind of had this logical separation between stuff that's consistent across your Joomla install for your given setup, between your dev environment on your laptop, say, and your production environment that sits wherever it is in this cloud, in this AWS cloud thing or whatever it is. And this kind of, and the generic stuff like your site name. So I'm sure that's probably quite a lot to take in. So I'm just going to kind of summarize this a bit. We just set up a fully automated Joomla environment with 7 CLI commands and a JSON config file. And that means that from nothing, literally, we can spin up our environment again and again and again, deleting it all down every time and just repeating it at will. And we also have some really cool visibility of the environment in a way that we may not have. So we can look at kind of our network usage, our CPU usage, our disk usage, how full our disks are, all these kinds of things that kind of would be covered by your PHP host traditionally, but they kind of also wouldn't be. Like, you never quite, if things start to go pop, you don't really know where like your performance issues are, and you just have to close your eyes, ask your host, and hope that they can figure it out for you, often in a time-consuming way. And you can also pop your Joomla logs into these systems and look at auditing and all that kind of stuff that you wouldn't have. The reason I chose to show you these things, even though CPU and disk usage isn't maybe necessarily the most relevant thing for a Joomla site, is because I didn't actually have to change a single thing to get this. This was automatically set up for me as part of my install. Obviously, you can tweak these settings to be slightly more relevant for your setups. We've just kind of looked around a bit at this kind of automated Joomla setup where we've spun up an instance of Joomla with like 7 commands and shut our eyes, and it's all been created magically for us. And so this kind of comes on to the next thing that I want to talk about, which is CLI control. I guess the first thing is why is CLI back in fashion and why are we using it? So the reality is that many people have been getting back into CLIs for a while now. We've been doing Git development with CLI. People who in Joomla use Docker containers, and I know there's quite a few people who've been going around and talking about Docker containers recently, have been used their CLI. And it's partly because companies are making automation a priority. They see safety as running the same bash command, copy paste again and again and again, always getting the same result, as opposed to trying to get a human to do it and like 90% of the time they get it right and 10% of the time they get it wrong. And it works great as a complement to APIs, which are, I'm sure most people know from the talks again in the Joomla ecosystem, are coming into the mainstream. But there's kind of 2 different types of commands that CLIs that exist these days. There's what we call client-side and server-side CLIs. Client-side CLIs run outside the server, like the AWS CLI we just saw. They don't run on AWS setups. I ran that on my laptop. And it allows me to kind of manage data in my site, but outside of my site. In a Joomla setup, for example, this may allow you to create events on someone else's event site or manage their products on your site. And generally, you'll use your website's API to exchange data and will require some sort of authentication. So, for example, when I configured my AWS site, I had to specify my access key. The other option is you can have what's called a server-side CLI. So this runs on the server that you're hosting your platform on. So an example would be the WordPress CLI, Joomla 4's CLI, even the existing Joomla CLI. And you're going to use that to manage your servers, so performing backups, updates, those kinds of operations. And you won't require authentication as you actually are physically on the server, and that effectively server authentication is your authentication. And it can even help you do development work, and Laravel Artisan is a prime example of this. And Is this relevant to the CMS? Absolutely. CMSs are increasingly using this. The WordPress CLI tool, which is officially sponsored by Automatic, the main WordPress developers, has over 4.3K stars on GitHub. That's more than Joomla's main repository, which only has 3.6K. So this is absolutely something that is relevant to the CMS ecosystem. And I'll use this to kind of shout out the Joomla 4's new CLI, which is being based on the Symfony library and has kind of buy-in and some excitement from several major extension providers, including Akiba already, who noted on Twitter that it was about time Joomla had added a proper CLI. And this allows the automation of basic functionalities for day-to-day maintenance. Of course, this doesn't mean that there is a backend for people who are not confident with a CLI already. That backend in the browser isn't going anywhere. This is just another option for people to use. And most people have a basic setup they want these days and a set of extensions they configure onto the majority of their websites. And you can imagine doing this in a single script, just immediately. So I'm going to talk a bit about APIs and kind of CLIs as my kind of final bit of this talk. So again, are APIs relevant to CMS? Yes. Many people already use them on an existing Joomla site. Your backups into AWS, which is already long been an Akiba feature, integrations with things like MailChimp, Google Analytics, your payment providers. These are all examples where you already will use an API in your existing website to another website. And if you're building a website where customers can do administration on your site, so a shop where people can add their products or an event site where people are publishing their events on your website, there's going to be demand for this and across different environments too. So if we think about what the characteristics of a modern HTTP API are, then, and I specifically say HTTP here, then there's kind of like a language, an ability to filter, pagination, authorization, authentication, and documentation. These are all things that if you actually were building a traditional backend for a CMS that you'd think about, right? You're going to have a language that your users will use. So maybe that's English or German or French. And in an API, those languages are JSON variants normally, but they don't have to be, but they generally are. JSON LD, JSON API are generally two of the most popular I've seen, but there's plenty of them. Filtering and searching for data is something that people do all the time. Having that paginated when there's lots of data is a thing people do lots of the time. In APIs, we generally use an authentication system called OAuth, which allows a variety of different API setups, whether that's with like a front-end page site, which I know is something that Joomla use a lot of, backing onto Joomla, or a server site, server to server, or any of these things OAuth supports. Good documentation is essential because people need to be able to know how to use your API, even if it's internal to your own site or from your mobile app into your main site. The good documentation is essential. And generally, the final characteristic that you may is less relevant, say, to a normal site is that you use the right HTTP methods for a RESTful interface. As REST is generally considered our go-to these days. Sometimes GraphQL for lots of nested data structures, but generally REST. And that's basically responding to the four main methods, which is post and get, put or patch for updating resources, and delete. And again, Joomla 4 is starting to deal with this. We're allowing you to interact with Joomla through other mediums. It's extendable, which allows you to add custom endpoints and with plugins. And it's got an extendable authentication system. We don't use OAuth. We have our own server-side tool that kind of keeps things easy, but it will be easily extendable to include OAuth. And so, aware that I'm running out of time, I am going to just very quickly mention that, finally, OpenAPI is a method that we use and lots of people use for documenting APIs in JSON or YAML. It was originally called Swagger. I encourage you to go look at their website if you want to know more. You can see that there are tons of companies, including eBay, Google, the UK government, IBM, loads of big companies that contribute to this product, Postman. And it's super cool because it allows you to basically define what all the information on your API into one thing. And why is this useful? Well, there's a couple of reasons. The first is generating documentation. You can auto-generate documentation based on your OpenAPI file. Redocs is one of my personal favorite tools for this. And you can see an example using a pet store sample site on the right there. For me, the fact that it's just pure HTML and CSS and JavaScript makes it super customizable, super easy to work with. The other thing is Swagger Docs. Why is this nice? Because it basically gives you the ability to try out all these URLs. So you can see on the right-hand side there's a try it out button, and that allows you to go and edit your Swagger definition on the left, and also make samples on the right. And that's actually what we use to power our own Joomla download site API, which you can see the link to the docs above, and you can see how it's very similar. Slightly bootstrap styled, but very similar to the Swagger editor in the main image there. I was hoping to go through Swagger editor, but I think I'm going to be out of time, so I'm going to skip over that. And I'm going to talk about one last thing, which is that people these days like to build SDKs. These are language-specific things, so like a Node.js, a PHP, a Java wrapper around the API to make it super easy for people to interact with their website's API. And one of the cool things is that Azure, which is the Microsoft Cloud offering, has this open source tool that allows you to generate full SDKs in languages just from an open API definition. So I can generate a PHP wrapper for my API where people just have to pass in the different parameters to the API without having to write a single line of code. They just have to pass in their open API file. And it guarantees parity between libraries, which is relevant if you've got lots of API endpoints and lots of languages you're supporting. Generally, probably only relevant to larger sites, and I'd say this is definitely an advanced topic, but it's just an idea. I want to give you an idea of how powerful just a single definition of your API can be. And finally, to bring it all back around, we can go back to this concept of client-side CLIs. So you can have authentication and requests made through the API, and you can imagine now how this wraps. And I wanted to give you an idea of this. You can see Contentful's examples there, Stripe's examples. These are all examples of CLIs that reach out to an API to kind of do the magic underneath. The API token will be largely stored locally on the computer you're running it from. So in AWS CLI, it's in that location. There's lots of cool things you can do to make a friendly GUI. And this last link I added in about 5 minutes before my talk started because someone dropped it in my work Slack channel as a really nice little tool. And it tells you about the kind of things that make a nice CLI. So kind of rushed the last few slides, but I'm going to have to sum up. A modern website is based around the ability to deploy quick and fast updates. And part of the reason for this is that languages are evolving at a faster and faster rate. You know, the PHP release cycle is going faster and faster. And if I had to say why, it's, in my opinion, due to like the increased agile nature of projects. So especially in digital agencies, these people work in agile methodologies, sprints, and all that kind of thing, which encourages you to work fast and hard. And if you make mistakes, you clean it up in a week's time. As well as, as I said, the faster growth of the PHP language and the cloud. And frameworks take advantage of these features, for PHP unit and that kind of thing, who basically drop support for PHP versions fairly early. And this is kind of highly driven by medium and large size companies, this automation driven by increased use of the CLI and API. And so, you know, this fast rate of work has basically been, as I say, been built around the CLI and API to basically reduce the impact of human error as people work quickly. Many digital agencies have moved into the cloud to take advantage of managed offerings by cloud providers. Still gives you the ability to control your data, unlike Wix and Squarespace. But it gives you kind of more offerings than those given by the traditional PHP hosters, because you have all these extra things that, you know, you may need a niche service, you know, some machine learning on some project, or I mean, okay, I don't think as many people are going to do that in the Joomla ecosystem, but like there's lots of these small little offerings that give you the ability that some projects serverless may be what you need. You may want to use Docker on some things for a specific project. Like all these things exist, which don't exist in your traditional shared PHP host. Cost differences do exist. AWS is going to be slightly more expensive, but to be honest, in the grand scheme of things, for anything other than kind of small blogs or small startups, they're fairly negligible. I mean, £19 a month for a website is kind of ballpark the same as you will get on some, you know, medium-sized hosts, PHP hosts. Obviously, I'm not talking about the super cheap ones. Okay, so what did we do in this talk? We looked at the services involved in deploying Joomla into a cloud provider, AWS. We looked at the small changes that make Joomla more in tune with the larger PHP ecosystem. So that was our .NET files to try and standardize the configuration and make Joomla deploying Joomla more simple when deploying into the cloud, and the further work that would be required to make this realistic for Joomla hosting services. So that's the stuff we talked about with global configuration settings and how updates would work. We looked at automating the setup of this Joomla site from 0 to hero in 7 commands and 1 JSON file. We looked at why people are using CLIs. We differentiated these CLIs into server and client-side offerings and looked at the differences between them. We looked at the demand for this as a service in the CMS marketplace. We saw WordPress CLI with lots and lots of, the desire for that product. We looked at what to expect from an API, looked at documenting them, exposing them to clients with Open API and Swagger and Redocs. The last thing I'd say is that, yes, I've talked about things that are relatively technically complicated, but are these, and I guess the ultimate question is, are these concepts relevant to Joomla sites? And the answer is no, they're not relevant to every Joomla site, but they are relevant to lots that fall into Joomla's target market. There's a lot of people building websites that might want to use Joomla, but decide that it's old-fashioned. We can't deploy it easily on our hosting setup for one of these reasons. So it doesn't mean it's relevant to every site, but it's certainly relevant to many sites. So just because it may not be relevant for your specific use case doesn't make it irrelevant to the Joomla ecosystem as a whole. And with that, I'd like to finish. I'm sorry, I think I've massively overshot a bit, but hopefully it was interesting.
Oh, no, awesome. We have one question in the chat from Martin. How many large-scale projects have you run on AWS or other cloud platforms using Joomla in particular?
Using Joomla in particular, a handful, like about half a dozen.
Okay. And AWS is your preferred platform when it comes, if you have the choice?
If I had the choice. I mean, it depends what company I'm working for, but generally, yes.
Okay. Do you have any specific examples of large-scale Joomla projects you can show, or are they all kind of under NDA or government business?
Yeah, it's government, I'm afraid.
Okay.
I mean, I can show you my little example setup, obviously, but it's just a sample thing.
Cool. Well, awesome. You've got a lot of positive feedback. A lot of people who are, I think, dabbling in the same area, trying to push Joomla forward and needing to do these more advanced things with Joomla. And I think quite a lot of the attendees learned a lot.
Yeah, I mean, as I say, it's not relevant to a lot of the smaller blogs, but I think absolutely, even in the small to medium scale businesses, there would be there's demand for this. I know. Actually, no, I think it was my girlfriend actually did a similar style project into AWS, but I think that was an internal Joomla site as well. I have to ask her. But I know, for example, in her company, this kind of stuff was stuff they were pining for. And that was also some of the reason that this talk got inspired from.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, George.